Hey everyone, welcome back to Honor for Hire, my turn-based RPG being developed in the Godot engine. Before I begin, I want to give a massive shout out to, how do I pronounce this? Yozoraki for offering to redesign the channel avatar. In my opinion, it is a big improvement over the last one, so let me know what you guys think. Since the last video, two major things have happened. First off, I've accomplished my goal of getting another enemy done. But it's not just your regular run-of-the-mill enemy, it's a mini-boss for the meadow. In the first devlog, you may have spotted this gold-armored fellow when I was talking about future enemies, and I eventually did get him added with just a basic sword attack. But over the past 2 months, though most of the work was done in the first one, he's been revamped into what I'm sure will be the first of many forms. The second thing that has happened is a massive one. We've hit 1,000 subscribers. This happened so fast, and it's honestly amazing that we managed to make it there with such a short time frame. Thank you to each and every one of you who subscribed, and to all of you who didn't, well, you must join our ranks. Be sure to join the Discord and leave any questions or suggestions in the comments below. Without further ado, let's get into it. The first order of business when it came to the mini-boss was animation. The goblin already had a walk, idle, and sword swipe attack, but my plan for the enemy called for 3 different attacks: a double swipe, a spin attack, and a move that buffs all goblins around it. My first target was the swipe since I already had it partially complete, and I needed to reanimate it for every direction that the goblin faces. I took the animations that already existed, copied and pasted some of the previous frames in reverse order, and made sure to change the direction that the swipe behind the sword was going. I also went back sometime last month and redid the animations for all of the sword swings so that they actually match the color of the swords, which I think is a big improvement on what I had before. I took the time to design a basic prep animation for each direction, which went even faster, and since each of the 4 directions followed the same process, it didn't take too long. Next up, the horn blast. This one was the most fun to animate, since once I got the horn design down, all I had to figure out was number 1, making him bring it up to his mouth, and number 2, the pattern of the effect. The goblin raises the horn into place and opens his mouth really wide before blasting out a note that comes out of the horn in repeating circles. I made sure to have him continue idling while blowing as well. This animation ended up taking twice the frames as most of my other ones, but thankfully that didn't cause an issue on the sprite sheet. Finally, the spin attack. This was by far the most difficult animation I've completed so far in the project, and it probably still needs more work. I began by taking key directions from each of the different animations for the goblin, one with the sword extended for each direction. This was easy enough. The tricky part came when I had to blend the 2 directions together for the in-between frame and make the movement of the goblin convincing. I ended up adding some motion blur that honestly looks a bit too much like long hair, but I'm considering making it more transparent to see if that improves the effect. For the attack itself, I designated a circle that the spin attack would fill out as it went along, starting as a smaller swipe but getting larger the farther it got. I went through the frames drawing them out, and as I reached the outer edges of the circle I made it trail off on the other end. The end result? This right here. As I said, I'm satisfied with the attack itself, I just need to put more work on those in-between frames. But with that, I was done with the sword goblin, at least for now. I went ahead and laid it out on a sprite sheet and imported it into Godot, then got the animation tree set up. The code is very similar to what the spear goblin is working with, and I went back and improved the direction choice. I can now call the vector that the blend spaces need, and this function will plug them all in. Thank you to Titus for the suggestion. Alright, the animations are in place and the functions are ready to be called. What happens next? The workflow I found helpful for creating this guy was to think through basic logic before actually coding out the full-on system. This started with the horn blast. I knew that I wanted it to only affect goblins, so I created a new group in global variables just for them. The horn blast attack will buff the health and attack of any nearby goblins by 1, as long as they're not already buffed, of course. As for how nearby, I decided on a path of a certain length that I can change depending on how it feels. The way this first draft worked was by creating a new path between the goblin to be buffed and the chieftain, then looking at the lengths of the path and whether the goblin has been powered up yet. If everything checks out, the chieftain will stop what it's doing and blast the horn. Of course, things got a lot more complicated, but that was the basics of the first attack, all completed. Next up was the easier of the 2 attacks to program, the spin attack. The logic for targeting was quite simple. Check if the player is within the surrounding squares, and if it is, target all of them. Thanks to my revamped target squares function, I can very easily test when I've got the correct tiles selected, so going through that testing was a breeze. The animation for the spin attack wasn't working properly though, because I didn't have a quick transition from the prep animation. I set up the animation tree as you see it here, and it worked. The script no longer had to run through the swipe attack to get to the spin, and all I had to do was add 2 separate variables to make sure the character knew what attack was prepared. This helped me out when it came time to do the next and most complicated attack, swipe time. Now, this one, as I just said, was a lot harder to do. I started by just making the enemy detect which side the player was on and whether they were in the targetable squares, which meant I needed to disable the spin attack for the time being. I got it to attack properly after prepping the action, so no problem there. Then as I was testing various cases, something caught my attention. Because of how I ordered the X and Y position checks, the goblin was facing sideways when it shouldn't be. The same issue occurred when I tried simply swapping them, so it wasn't going to be that easy. Eventually, I decided that I needed to return to a variable I'd worked with before, direction facing. The logic for direction choice is a bit complicated, but here's what it boils down to. If the character is in the outer ring, the direction choice is simple. If the character is within the inner circle, there are 2 square intervals for each direction that need to be checked. The goblin then stores the direction that it's facing and targets squares based on that. I can iterate through the cells in the tile map and check those factors to add targets at the positions that I want. It's quite intuitive and allows me to target tiles with a single append statement for each direction. I also made sure to clear the targets array before beginning this one so there's no multi-targeted tiles. With that, the swipe attack was done and ready to go. Next up, I wanted a random chance of each attack occurring if you're in the tiles directly surrounding the goblin, except the horn of course, which has its own set of conditions that I'll talk about in just a second. The random attack choice was quite easy though. I used the same logic that the spin attack uses and used a random number generator to pick an integer that's either 0 or 1. After that number is picked, I double check whether the character already has one of the 2 attacks prepped to make sure that it goes through with the final attack it needs to do. When finalizing the horn attack, I upgraded the script from merely buffing every goblin that came by to storing them in an array of targets. This array clears before every horn check to make sure that one of the goblins didn't leave the range of the horn. Once that array has at least 2 goblins in it, the Goblin Chieftain buffs them with a blast of the horn. This bit of code ensures that the player can't move while the goblin is playing, and it was necessary because the animation is twice the length of the others, meaning that some funky things can happen if I don't do that. I also went back later and added in a line that changes the color of the goblin based on whether or not they're buffed. They now have a more golden hue, which I might shift around depending on how it looks with the other goblins that I end up creating. Last but not least, it was time to actually make the animations go off. I don't want to store the command to animate within the attack itself because that can lead to some complications. It's a lot easier and cleaner to make it all take place in this single chunk of code that checks which action is prepped and carries it out. I also added the final bit of functionality to the swipe attack, a lunge forward. It moves based on the direction facing, but the important part is right here. The attack checks 3 different things before moving ahead. Number 1, will the attack cause an overlap with the character? Number 2, will it overlap another enemy? And number 3, will it move off the defined tile map? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, the chieftain goes without the lunge and just swipes twice in front of itself. Otherwise, it turns up the speed, waits for the animation to hit the part with the second swipe, done with this simple yield statement right here, and launches itself forward. With this last bit implemented, the Goblin Chieftain mini-boss is complete. This was a bit more of a focused devlog overall, and that's because most of my work was centered around creating this guy. It feels nice to get some more complicated attacks into the game, and it'll be interesting to see how I want to tackle the rest of them. Of course, I'm very open to any improvements for the Goblin Chieftain. This is basically a first draft of sorts, and if he needs to be balanced in any way, I can shift around his numbers or maybe mess with adding a new attack. But you can expect a good amount of progress for the next devlog. Maybe some new enemies, perhaps a bit of tweaking done on the art. Who knows? Once again, thank you to each and every one of you for helping me hit 1,000 subscribers. It's ridiculous that we got there this fast, and I hope that the channel continues to grow even faster. Of course, a lot of that's on me to post more devlogs, so it's time to get back to work. Thank you all for watching, and as always, take care.